In October of 1597, the fate of an entire kingdom rested on 13 wooden ships. Facing them across the water was the most terrifying naval force in Asia. Over 300 Japanese warships carrying thousands of elite samurai veterans determined to wipe the Korean kingdom of Joseon off the map. Just weeks earlier, Korea's king had sent an official royal decree to his naval commander, ordering him to abandon the sea, burn his remaining ships, and merge his survivors into the land army. The commander took a brush, dipped it in black ink, and wrote a reply that became legendary. "Your servant still has 12 ships. As long as I live, the enemy will never dare touch us on the sea." The man who wrote those words was Admiral Yi Sun-sin. He had just survived brutal imprisonment and torture at the hands of his own paranoid king. His entire fleet had been destroyed by an incompetent rival. He had no money, no reinforcements, and no margin for error. What happened next in the narrow waters of the Myeongnyang Strait was not just a victory. It was the greatest tactical miracle in naval warfare history. To understand why Yi Sun-sin was left with only 13 ships, you have to look at the catastrophic failure of the Joseon royal court. In 1592, Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched a massive invasion of Korea with over 150,000 samurai, intending to conquer China. On land, the Korean armies collapsed in weeks, but on the sea, Admiral Yi Sun-sin undefeatedly severed Japan's supply lines, utilizing heavy artillery and the legendary armored turtle ships. Yet, Yi's brilliant victories made him dangerous in the eyes of King Sengcho, who feared a military coup. Corrupted officials framed Yi for treason. In early 1597, the admiral was stripped of his rank, dragged in chains to the capital, and subjected to horrific torture. Command of the fleet was handed to his bitter rival, Won Yun, a boastful and reckless officer. In July 1597, at the Battle of Chilcholyung, Won Yun led the proud Joseon Navy of over 150 warships straight into an ambush. The entire Korean fleet was annihilated in a single night. Won Yun was killed, all the armored turtle ships were burned, and only 12 Panakson battleships escaped under an officer named Bei Sail. Terrified by the advancing Japanese army, the king reinstated Yi Sun-sin. When Yi arrived at the naval base, he found a hollow wasteland, terrified, starving sailors, an empty treasury, and 12 battered ships. He managed to salvage one more vessel from local carpenters, bringing his total fleet to 13. Japan's commanders believed the war was already won. Yi Sun-sin knew that in open water, his 13 ships would be surrounded and boarded in minutes. Japanese tactics relied on closing the distance, grappling enemy vessels, and unleashing lethal hand-to-hand samurai boarding parties. Korean ships, however, were built differently. The Panaksen was constructed from heavy, dense pine timber, with a flat bottom that made it a rock-solid artillery platform carrying heavy bronze cannons. Yi needed a battlefield where Japan's numbers would mean nothing. He found it in the Myeongnyang Strait, a narrow channel known locally as Uldomok, meaning the roaring water. Myeongnyang was a geographic nightmare. The strait was barely 300 yards wide at its narrowest point. It was lined with jagged, hidden underwater reefs. Most crucially, it contained one of the fastest, most violent tidal currents in the world, reaching speeds over 11 knots. Every 4 hours, the tide reversed direction with the force of a tidal wave, creating massive whirlpools that could spin heavy ships like toys. Yi positioned his 13 ships at the northern exit of the channel, anchoring across the mouth. On the morning of October 26, 1597, scouts reported the Japanese vanguard entering the southern end of the strait. 133 heavy combat vessels led the charge. with nearly 200 support ships waiting just behind. The current was flowing north, straight toward Admiral Yi. As the massive wall of Japanese warships surged through the strait, panic swept through the Korean line. Looking back, Admiral Yi saw that his 12 supporting ships had lost their nerve. Paralyzed by terror, they dropped back hundreds of yards, clinging to the coastal shallows. Yi Sun-sin's flagship stood completely alone in the center of the channel. For over an hour, one solitary Korean battleship held the line against the vanguard of the Japanese Empire. Yi ordered his gunners to load every bronze cannon, Heaven, Earth, and Black class cannons. As the Japanese ships crowded into the narrow bottleneck, unable to maneuver, Yi opened fire at point-blank range. Solid iron cannonballs, explosive shells, and giant wooden fire arrows tore through the light cedar hulls of the Japanese vessels. Samurai archers and musketeers poured thousands of rounds onto Yi's flagship, but the thick pine bulwarks of the Panoxion shielded the crew. Whenever a Japanese ship attempted to get close enough to throw grappling hooks, Yi's cannons obliterated them below the waterline. Yi stood on the upper command deck in plain view, unfazed by flying arrows, shouting orders through his signal horns. Realizing their commander was fighting to the death alone, the 12 lagging Korean captains were filled with shame. One by one, they rode furiously into the gap, forming an impenetrable wall of timber and fire beside their admiral. And then, precisely at midday, nature stepped into the battle. Around noon, the roaring water of Myeongyang came to a dead stop. For a few eerie seconds, the strait was completely still. Then, with a deafening roar, millions of tons of ocean water reversed direction and surged southward. The trap snapped shut. The violent current was now slamming directly into the front of the incoming Japanese fleet. Japanese ships, packed tightly together in the narrow channel, lost all steering control. Vessels spun out of control, smashing into each other, snapping their oars, and impaling themselves on the underwater reefs. With the current at their backs, the 13 Korean battleships surged forward. They rammed the disordered Japanese vanguard, firing broadsides from both flanks. The Japanese flagship was shattered and sunk. Its commander, Kurushima Michifusa, pulled from the water and decapitated in full view of the opposing fleet. Seeing their commander fallen and their ships trapped in a churning vortex of wreckage, total panic broke out among the samurai. The surviving Japanese vessels frantically turned around and fled into the open sea. When the smoke cleared over Myeongyang, the results sounded impossible. Over 31 Japanese battleships were completely destroyed, with dozens more damaged beyond repair. Over half of the Japanese command was killed or wounded. On the Korean side, not a single ship was lost. Only 2 Korean sailors were killed and 3 wounded on the flagship. The victory at Myeongyang completely broke the spine of the Japanese invasion. Without naval dominance, the Japanese army marching towards Seoul was starved of food, gunpowder, and reinforcements. Within months, Japanese forces were forced to abandon their advance and withdraw into coastal fortresses. Toyotomi Hideyoshi died the following year, and the Japanese invaders withdrew from Korea entirely. Admiral Yi Sun-sin would later fall in the final battle of the war at Noryang in 1598, dying as he lived, on the command deck of his flagship, ordering his men not to announce his death until the battle was won. Myeongyang remains an eternal testament to what happens when courage meets absolute mastery of nature. 13 ships didn't just win a battle, they saved a nation from being erased from history.